If you've ever seen a massive door swing on a tiny rusted hinge, you understand how history truly works. In the autumn of 1940, the hinge of the Second World War was a small cluster of airfields in southeast England. The Luftwaffe had their boot on the throat of the RAF, and they were seconds away from a knockout blow. But the cold, hard math of August 1940 tells a much darker tale. History suggests that by the final week of that sweltering summer, the RAF wasn't just tired, it was mathematically bankrupt. The runways were craters, the phone lines were severed, and Air Chief Marshal Dowding was quietly preparing for a total collapse. Then, something strange happened, something the textbooks often gloss over. A German navigator made a simple mistake. A few bombs fell where they weren't supposed to, and Adolf Hitler threw away a guaranteed victory to chase a ghost. We're going to peel back the propaganda to see why the Blitz wasn't a sign of German strength, but the greatest strategic blunder of the 20th century. The Royal Air Force was days away from collapse, until Hitler made a mistake. We were told that the Royal Air Force was a polished shield, standing firm against a disorganized enemy. But if you look closer at the records from late August 1940, the reality wasn't a movie. It was a grueling war of attrition that England was actually losing. We tend to think of German might as an unstoppable machine, yet by the third week of August, the Luftwaffe wasn't just a threat, it was a scalpel. They had stopped wandering aimlessly over the Channel and began a surgical strike on the one thing the British couldn't replace, the airfields of 11 Group in southeast England. You see, the common belief is that the Spitfire was the savior of the nation, but the truth is far more fragile. A Spitfire is useless if its runway is a moonscape of craters and its fuel lines are severed. By late August, the big wing theory was failing. The RAF wasn't just short on planes, they were running out of time. Historical records show that during this Adeltag, or Eagle attack phase, the Germans were hitting sector stations like Biggin Hill and Kenley with such frequency that the ground crews were working in literal craters, trying to patch together Spitfires with spit and wire. Many of us remember the feeling of a machine reaching its breaking point, that high-pitched whine before the engine seizes. That was the RAF in 1940. A staggering statistic often overlooked is that between August 24th and September 6th, the RAF lost 295 fighters destroyed and 171 badly damaged. More importantly, they lost 103 pilots killed and 128 wounded. That was a quarter of their total strength in just a fortnight. Therefore, the might of Germany wasn't a myth. It was a closing vice. To the men sitting in the concrete bunkers of Uxbridge, the math was simple and terrifying. If the Luftwaffe kept hitting the airfields for just one more week, the RAF would have been forced to withdraw north of the Thames. This would have left the English Channel open, the Royal Navy without air cover, and the beaches of Kent defenseless against Operation Sea Lion. We think of the victory as inevitable because we know how the story ends. But in the smoldering heat of August 1940, the reality was that the British shield was cracked, glowing red, and seconds away from shattering completely. The German strategy was working. To understand the gravity of late August 1940, we have to look past the dogfights and into the quiet, map-strewn offices of Bentley Priory. This is where Sir Hugh Dowding, the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, sat. Many of us know Dowding as the architect of victory, but in those final days of August, he was an architect watching his foundations crumble. He wasn't looking at the sky, he was looking at the ledger. The specific problem Dowding faced wasn't just a lack of aircraft, it was the erosion of his system. We often hear about the Dowding system, the world's first integrated air defense network. It relied on radar, telephone lines, and plotting tables. But by August 24th, that system was being systematically blinded. The Germans weren't just dropping bombs, they were cutting the nerves of the British defense. When a sector station like Biggin Hill or Manston was hit, it wasn't just a hangar that burned. It was the phone lines, the radio controllers, and the intelligence that told a pilot where to find the enemy. Dowding saw a logical conclusion that the public was never told. A blind fighter force is a dead fighter force. History suggests that the most dangerous moment in any struggle is when your capacity to recover is outpaced by the rate of destruction. Dowding's purple value, the cold, hard data, was chilling. Between August 24th and September 6th, the RAF was losing an average of 20 aircraft a day, but the factories were only producing about 15. That's a deficit of 5 planes every single sunrise. To a man of Dowding's mathematical precision, this wasn't a brave stand, it was a countdown to zero. Many of us remember the feeling of a budget that simply won't stretch to the end of the month. Dowding was balancing a budget of human lives and Merlin engines, and he was firmly in the red. The value here is in the pilot crisis. The RAF was losing seasoned veterans, men with hundreds of hours, and replacing them with 5-minute boys. These were youngsters with barely 10 hours in a hurricane, sent up to face the battle-hardened aces of the Luftwaffe. Dowding knew that even if he had 1,000 planes, they were useless without the hands to fly them. He predicted that by the second week of September, the RAF would no longer be a functional fighting force in the South. He was already drafting the orders to pull his remaining squadrons back to the Midlands, effectively ceding the skies over the English Channel. A nuance often escapes the history books. Dowding's prediction wasn't based on a lack of courage, but on a critical failure of infrastructure. The Luftwaffe had finally struck the Achilles heel. By focusing their entire weight on the sector stations, the brains of the RAF, they were achieving what months of channel skirmishes couldn't. They were effectively paralyzing the defense. This left Dowding with a grim reality, a tactical retreat that would have looked like a total defeat. He was prepared to let the airfields burn to save the core of the RAF for a final stand over London. It was a bleak, pragmatic math that weighed the survival of the nation against the loss of the coast. What is staggering to realize looking back is just how thin the margin truly was. We often think of the few as a fixed group, yet they were a rapidly dwindling resource. On August 31st, the RAF suffered its worst day of the entire war. 13 pilots were killed and another 7 wounded, a loss that in terms of strategic impact far outweighed the German casualties that day. Crucially, this is where the narrative shifts from the cold logic of a commander to the erratic psychology of a dictator. Dowding had calculated for every variable except one, the ego of Adolf Hitler. He had prepared for a continued assault on his airfields, a move that likely would have ended the RAF. Yet at the very moment Dowding waited for the final blow to fall on his sector stations, a single navigational error over the city of London was about to throw his cold calculations and the entire German strategy straight into the bin. History has a funny way of turning on a dime, often because of a single tired man making a simple mistake. While Air Chief Marshal Dowding was staring at his maps, bracing for the total collapse of his airfield defenses, the entire trajectory of Western civilization was about to be altered by a compass error. To understand the gravity of this, we have to remember the Gentleman's Agreement of 1940. It sounds strange to us now, but at the start of the Battle of Britain, both sides had a specific, unspoken rule: you don't bomb the civilian heart of the enemy's capital. Hitler had strictly forbidden the Luftwaffe to attack London. He wasn't being kind, he was being pragmatic. He wanted the British to surrender, not to become a hornet's nest of vengeful civilians. On the night of August 24, 1940, one of history's greatest accidents occurred. A small group of Heinkel H-111 bombers, lost in the soup of a cloudy night and harassed by primitive anti-aircraft fire, drifted off course. The crews believed they were over the oil terminals at Thames Haven. In reality, they were directly over the residential heart of London. They toggled their bomb bay doors, and for the first time in the war, high explosives whistled down onto the civilian streets of the East End and the City of London. This unintended strike broke the unspoken gentleman's agreement that had kept the capital cities off limits, setting off a chain reaction that would eventually derail Hitler's entire air campaign. Many of us know that Winston Churchill was not a man to let a punch go unreturned. The value here is the speed of the British retaliation. Churchill didn't wait for an apology or an explanation. Within 24 hours, he ordered Bomber Command to do the unthinkable: fly to Berlin. At the time, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously boasted that if a single Allied bomb falls on Berlin, you can call me Meyer, a slang way of saying I'm a liar. On the night of August 25th, 81 British bombers proved him a liar. The damage to Berlin was militarily insignificant, a few sheds and a summer house, but the psychological reward was massive. It was a slap in the face to a regime built on the myth of invincibility. Imagine the scene at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. Hitler was a man who thrived on the contrast principle. He saw himself as the master of the skies. To have British ramshackle bombers, as he called them, dropping fire on his capital was an intolerable insult. This is where the logic of the war broke down. The specific fact that changed everything is this: Hitler's rage blinded him to the military reality that he was winning. On September 4th, he stood at the Sportpalast in Berlin and screamed to a frenzied crowd, "If they attack our cities, we will simply rub out theirs." He ordered a total shift in strategy. He told his generals to stop wasting bombs on those pesky airfields in the countryside and to start burning London to the ground. This was the Berlin provocation. It was a pivot born of pure, unadulterated ego. From a mechanical perspective, it was like a boxer who has his opponent on the ropes, one punch away from a knockout, but suddenly decides to stop punching the ribs and starts trying to shout the opponent into submission instead. For the men of the RAF, this was the miracle they didn't dare pray for. While the smoke rose from the ruins of London's docks, the silence over the airfields of Biggin Hill and Manston was deafening. The pressure was gone. The value for the British was the gift of time, time they used to fill the craters, repair the phone lines, and let their exhausted pilots sleep for more than 4 hours a session. Therefore, the navigational error of a few lost German pilots didn't just cause a fire in London, it extinguished the fire that was burning through the RAF's last reserves. It was a strategic blunder of such proportions that military historians still shake their heads at it today. Hitler traded a guaranteed military victory for a failed psychological one. He believed by rubbing out London, he would break the British spirit. He thought a 65-year-old Londoner whose house had just been turned to rubble would demand peace. But as we know, and as the reality would soon show, he completely misunderstood the character of the people he was fighting. The stage was set for the great pivot. Hitler was about to commit the Luftwaffe to a battle they were never designed to win, all because he couldn't stand the thought of being mocked in his own backyard. The strategic math had been discarded in favor of a personal vendetta. This decision, born from a bruised ego, shifted the target from the RAF's vital airfields to the sprawling streets of London. In doing so, Hitler unknowingly handed the British the one thing they desperately needed: the space to breathe and the time to rebuild. In the high-stakes game of global conflict, there is a fundamental rule: never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. As the calendar turned to September 1940, Air Chief Marshal Dowding watched with a mixture of disbelief and guarded relief as the German Luftwaffe did exactly that. They pivoted. To understand the sheer magnitude of this error, we have to look at the Great Pivot not as a change in targets, but as a total abandonment of the only strategy that was actually working. For weeks, the Germans had been winning a war of attrition. By switching to a war of terror, they moved from a battle they were winning to one they were fundamentally unequipped to finish. The disaster was rooted in Hitler's obsession with the psychological knockout blow. He believed that the British Empire was a house of cards, held together by nothing more than prestige and the stiff upper lip of the London elite. He reasoned that if he could set the capital on fire, the common man would rise up and demand an end to the war. It was a massive projection of his own fears. Because he controlled his own people through fear, he assumed the British could be controlled the same way. However, the cold tactical reality is that the Luftwaffe was a tactical air force, not a strategic one. Many of us who have worked with tools know that you don't use a finishing hammer to drive a railroad spike. The German planes, like the Dornier Do-17 and the Heinkel He-111, were designed to support fast-moving tanks on a battlefield, not to level a metropolitan area of 8 million people. They lacked the heavy payload and the long-range endurance of the four-engine heavies the Allies would later use against Germany. When the first massive wave of nearly 1,000 aircraft, bombers and fighters, swarmed toward London on the afternoon of September 7th, it looked like the end of the world. For the people on the ground in the East End, it was a waking nightmare of fire and falling masonry. But for the RAF controllers in their underground bunkers, it was something else entirely. It was a target. By moving the fight to London, the Germans unwittingly solved the RAF's biggest problem. When the Luftwaffe attacked the airfields in Kent and Sussex, the British had very little time to react. The distance from the coast was too short. But by flying all the way to London, the Germans gave the British radar operators and plotters an extra 10 to 15 minutes of warning. This leads to a critical realization often missed in the history books. The shift to London actually made the RAF more effective. Those extra minutes of travel time for the German bombers allowed the British squadrons to climb higher, gather in larger formations, and attack the Luftwaffe from the sun side. The hunter suddenly became the hunted. By forcing the Germans to fly further inland, the British radar system provided the defenders with the luxury of time, a luxury that was non-existent when the targets were the coastal airfields. History suggests that Hitler's decision was the ultimate sunk cost fallacy. He had already invested so much in the air war that he felt he needed a dramatic, visible result to justify the losses to the German public. He wanted to see the Great Fire of London on the evening newsreels. In doing so, he traded a strategic victory, the destruction of the RAF's infrastructure, for a psychological ruin that never actually materialized. The true strength of the British response was found in the rubble. Instead of breaking, the civilian population hardened. We've all seen the photos of the milkman making his rounds over heaps of bricks, or the business as usual signs in shattered shop windows. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a profound miscalculation by German intelligence. They had predicted a revolution. They got a volunteer fire brigade. The Great Pivot represents the moment the Luftwaffe lost its grip on the initiative. By September 15th, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, the Germans launched 2 massive strikes against London, confident that the RAF was down to its last 50 planes. Instead, they were met by over 300 Hurricanes and Spitfires. The Germans lost 60 aircraft in a single afternoon. The myth of the last planes was shattered, revealing that while the city was scarred, the Air Force was anything but defeated. Many of us know the feeling of a gamble that doesn't pay off, where you realize halfway through that you've bet the house on a losing hand. On the evening of September 15th, the Luftwaffe commanders realized the psychological ruin they intended for London had actually been visited upon their own air crews. They were exhausted, their planes were shot to pieces, and the defeated RAF was hitting them harder than ever. While the bombs were falling on London and the German generals were scratching their heads, something incredible was happening back at those ruined airfields in the south. The Great Pivot didn't just save London from a quick surrender, it gave birth to the miracle of the quiet skies. While the city burned, the RAF was doing something that would eventually win the war. They were rebuilding in the shadows. This period of unexpected calm allowed the ground crews to perform a feat of industrial resurrection. Instead of dodging shrapnel, they were finally able to patch the runways, reconnect the vital telephone lines, and bring the damaged fighters back to combat readiness. It was a recovery that the Luftwaffe, convinced they had already destroyed these bases, never saw coming. While the night sky over London was a hellscape of searchlights and screaming sirens, the rural counties of Kent and Sussex experienced a strange, haunting silence. This was the miracle of the quiet skies. For weeks, the ground crews at the sector stations had lived like moles, ducking into slit trenches every time a Junkers 88 hummed overhead. But suddenly, the pressure vanished. The Luftwaffe had turned its back on the airfields, and in that breathing room, the RAF performed a feat of industrial resurrection that was as vital as any dogfight. The specific problem the British faced in early September was a cascading failure. It wasn't just that the hangars were gone, it was that the specialized technicians, the men who knew how to calibrate a Merlin engine or patch a radio, were being killed or driven to exhaustion. But once the German bombers began heading for the city docks instead of the runways, the RAF ground organization went into overdrive. The purple value here is the sheer speed of the recovery. History suggests that during this quiet period, the Air Ministry's Works Department performed minor miracles. They didn't just patch holes, they decentralized. They moved repair shops into local garages, tucked spare parts under haystacks in nearby farms, and laid miles of new, buried telephone cable to replace the vulnerable lines the Germans had previously severed. Many of us remember a time when we had to fix something on the fly with whatever was at hand. That was the spirit of 1940. The value to the viewer is understanding that the RAF didn't just survive, it evolved. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, the RAF's ground control system, the nervous system of the defense, was actually stronger than it had been at the start of August. They had installed beauty sets, emergency mobile radio units that could take over if a main station was hit. They had turned the airfields into shell targets that looked abandoned from the air but were humming with activity in hidden workshops. The most critical part of this miracle wasn't mechanical, it was human. The reality of pilot recovery during this period cannot be overstated. With the shift to London, British pilots who bailed out over English soil were often back at their squadrons within hours, sometimes in time to fly a second or third sortie. In contrast, every German pilot who bailed out was a permanent loss to the Luftwaffe, destined for a prisoner of war camp. During the quiet skies period, the RAF finally caught up. For the first time in the battle, the number of fresh pilots arriving from the training units actually began to outpace the number of casualties. While the world watched London burn and assumed the end was near, the RAF was quietly sharpening its blade. The silence over the airfields wasn't a sign of death, it was the sound of a fighter force catching its second wind. By the time the Luftwaffe High Command looked down from their vantage points and wondered why the defeated RAF was still rising to meet them, the window of opportunity had slammed shut. Many of us know the feeling of a comeback, that moment when you've been counted out, but you've used the time in the corner to find your strength. The turning point for the British was that by late September, they were no longer fighting for survival, they were fighting for dominance. They had survived the Eagle attack, endured the Blitz, and emerged with a force that was battle-hardened and structurally sound. This recovery came at a terrible price for the civilians below. The RAF was being rebuilt in the shadows of London's burning, a grim trade-off where the city's sacrifice became the Air Force's salvation. As the smoke finally began to clear, Hitler was left looking at a map that no longer made sense. He had burned the city, but he had lost the sky. By trading the destruction of airfields for the terror bombing of civilians, he had inadvertently allowed his most dangerous enemy to heal. The strategic window for Operation Sea Lion had not just closed, it had been welded shut by his own hand. By the end of October 1940, the grand ambition of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, wasn't just postponed, it had become a ghost of a strategy. Hitler had allowed his emotions to dictate his military doctrine, and in doing so, he handed the keys to the kingdom back to the British. The specific problem for the German High Command was that they could never unring the bell. Once they moved to the Blitz, they lost the tactical momentum required to suppress the RAF airfields. History suggests that in warfare, as in life, some opportunities only knock once. The window where the RAF was truly vulnerable had been small, and it was now bolted shut. The permanent shift in the Luftwaffe capability serves as a stark reminder of the cost of ego. They had lost over 1,700 aircraft and thousands of their most experienced aircrews, the irreplaceable veterans who had spearheaded the blitzkriegs in Poland and France. Many of us know that while you can buy new equipment, you simply cannot buy decades of experience. The Luftwaffe that limped away from the Battle of Britain was a shadow of the force that had entered it. Unable to solve the British problem, Hitler's gaze began to drift. He turned his eyes towards the Soviet Union, convinced that a quick victory in the East would force Churchill to the table. It was a fatal flaw in the German narrative. They couldn't win in the West, yet they believed they could ignore the West while they fought a war of annihilation in the East. Looking back, we can see that the war was, in many ways, decided in those few weeks of late August. By choosing psychological ruin over strategic victory, Hitler ensured that the British Isles would remain an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the very base from which the liberation of Europe would eventually be launched. If you appreciate this level of detail and a narrative that respects your intelligence, please consider liking this video and following the channel. It's the best way to tell the algorithm that there is still a massive audience for long-form, thoughtful history. We're building a space here for those who prefer the how and why over simple sound bites. If you know someone, a friend, a veteran, or a fellow history buff who would appreciate this perspective on Hitler's strategic blunders, please share it with them. Your support allows us to keep digging deeper.